Yeah, so you mentioned that Gillian Sankoff was my advisor, and at the time that I was in graduate school, Gillian was developing some ideas about language change across the lifespan, and as you may know, she had access to, because she'd helped create it, a big longitudinal corpus of sociolinguistic interviews conducted in Montreal, originally in 1971 under Gillian's aegis, and then there was a follow-up study in 1984, and then a third one in 1995, and in each case, participants from the original study in 1971 were relocated and re-interviewed. So she had a big grant to work on this data, and I was fortunate enough to be her research assistant for several years while I was at Penn. In fact, it was wonderful. The downside was I wasn't ever a teaching assistant, so when I took this job, I didn't have any teaching experience. So that was a bit of a pitfall. But in any case, I really enjoyed working with her on this data, and we actually also had a reading group on language change across the lifespan, and I became really interested in all the outstanding questions associated with whether and how individuals change their speech as they age. And of course, coincidentally, Paul was working on this question as well while he was writing his MA thesis at very much the same time. So I decided that I wanted to do a longitudinal study, but within the confines of a PhD, of course, you can't say I'm going to come back in 10 years and re-interview these people. So I asked myself how I could get maximum information from the minimum time span or elapse of time. And of course, also around this time, Penny Eckert had been publishing lots of her work on the Belton High students, and she was doing follow-up work with middle schoolers. And I think around that time I began to ask myself, well, what happens to those kids after that study, right? In the sense of what happens to a jock or a burnout once they've graduated from high school? Do they continue to behave linguistically the way they did in high school? Do you continue to see that divergence between the different ends of the social continuum? Or do they actually, with the passing of time and becoming middle-aged, all tend to sort of converge? And obviously I couldn't follow people into middle age, but I did wonder about the transition from high school into college, which is exactly the transition that Paul was looking at too. And Penny had shown that the transition from junior high into high school is also a big social transition for people that comes with linguistic transitions. So I wondered if there was going to be a similar transition. So I made the assumption, a similar one to Paul, I think, that even though I would only be looking at 1 year in the life of a panel participant, it would be a socially important enough year that we might see linguistic consequences. So for my dissertation, I followed, actually I can't even tell you how many people I interviewed in the first year, but probably something like 60, 65 or more, of whom about half I was able to re-interview the following year. So they were mostly seniors in their high school the first year, and then they were freshmen in college the second year. And I've actually just, in the last couple of years, been back to find more of them. So in 2012, I went back to Philadelphia and I re-interviewed about a dozen of the original participants. So they're all in their mid-20s now, which meant that for some of those interviews there were babies in the background and there were sort of acoustic issues that I hadn't had to deal with in earlier rounds of the study. So in the end, what I ended up focusing my attention on subsequently was a very old variable. I had been looking at the in-ing alternation, and actually what I'm doing at the moment is looking at the participation of these women in ongoing sound changes. So rather, as Paul did for people who moved to Toronto and participated in the Canadian shift, I'm looking at changes in the phonetics and phonology of ongoing sound changes in these girls. But what I've actually published on so far is mostly on in-ing, and that's a variable that we know is stable across community time. We've got pretty good evidence going back many centuries that that's the case, and so this is a really nice base to start from, because we know that if people change the way they speak with respect to in-ing, we can be pretty sure that's age grading, right, in the classical sense. And that's one of the points I think I make in the paper that you've just read, is that you really have to know that the community is stable to define age grading as age grading in that kind of classical sense. But funnily enough, no, although lots of people had made assumptions about in-ing being age graded, the idea being that you use less of the non-standard variant as you age, that was all inferred from cross-sectional studies from apparent time. And I wanted to be able to show whether that really does happen in real time as well. And it does, but maybe as you would expect, it happens differentially for different subgroups. So women who went to colleges that recruited from a very large pool of people, sometimes from across the country, were more likely to change their speech in the direction of standard ing, whereas students who went to local colleges that drew from local pools of participants tended not to do that. In fact, they changed almost not at all, continued to maintain a very high rate of the non-standard alveolar in variant. So that's what I've done. So I guess most of my work thus far has been on these stable variables, and with Gillian Sankoff working on Montreal French, we've also been looking at variables that are either very sort of stable or almost stable, changing very, very slowly over time. So that is what I have mostly been doing. And more recently, I've been going in two other directions. So I'm looking at, I'm continuing to look at the transition to college, but this time I'm doing it in apparent time. And Bill LeBove and I are simultaneously in Philadelphia and here in East Lansing, looking at freshmen at a range of colleges, again, from the kind of nationally oriented through to the very locally oriented. And we're looking to see whether students abandon local phonology when they make that transition. And because we're doing it in apparent time, we are comparing them not with themselves, but with members of their social network who are older and younger than them. And we've only been collecting data here in East Lansing since about middle of March. So I can't really tell you anything about it yet, but that's what we're doing. And the other thing I've been doing is considering something very, very different, but I hope ultimately aligned with these questions, which is, are there individual differences, right? Are there differences at the individual level in how people pick up on ongoing sound changes and continue to, at some level, pay attention to them as they grow older? And does that help to determine whether or not you continue to participate? So I've done some experiments with students here where we've been looking at their sort of social aptitude and awareness of patterns and attention to detail and things that you might think would help you in being aware of the fact that socially conditioned variation, fluctuates, has frequency distributions that you can tap into. And so we've been using a measure of autistic characteristics to get at that. So that all the students, so far as we know, are undiagnosed, not on the autism spectrum, but we're using this measure as a general way of getting at their sort of individual perceptive differences. And it looks as if that really might be quite fruitful, actually.
Right. So getting back to some of the ideas that you bring up and discuss in your paper, it's yeah. So working with the idea that stability is kind of a requirement to understand age grading. This maybe a good place to start would be to talk about LeBove's table of types of generational changes.
Sure.
And this, I think, was originally from one of his change books, internal or external factors, maybe, adapted by Sankoff, or added to by Sankoff.
Yes.
So the stability is fairly clear. So when you have a case of stability, the individual is doing something stable and the community is stable at the same time.
Right.
Age grading is fairly understandable, is when the individual changes but the community stays the same.
Right.
And then I think generational change and communal change might be a little more complicated than the other ones.
Right.
So the individual is stable, but the community is unstable when it comes to generational changes.
Right.
Right. Okay. So I guess yeah. So I was just maybe thought we could like walk through some of some examples maybe,
Sure.
and just to flesh it out a little bit so that we're all on the same page. So yeah.
Want me to start? So stability, yeah, is the idea that there's nothing happening. It's like the absolute null hypothesis.
Yeah.
And I would bet that this is probably not very common, actually, right? That it's hard to imagine many corners of any given language that are not undergoing some kind of change. But anyway, that's the idea that that's the null case. Age grading.
Sorry, was it already interrupting it? It'd be interesting. I wonder if there are like things that there are. Well, I guess they wouldn't be very much good as variables if there was no variation, right? So, if an individual if there's no age appropriate variation and no community variation, then we'd just be looking at something that doesn't exist. I guess there's something that we wouldn't classify as a sociolinguistic variable.
Right. We might say it's variable, but it's variable in an entirely predictable, like a phonological rule, right? That there's entirely predictable variation, but with no social meaning attached to it.
Right. Right. Okay. That's
unless Bill means the case of a true sociolinguistic variable that is just not changing. Like the social meaning remains constant, the distribution remains constant. It's the same in every generation. But it's hard to imagine such a case where social meanings remain stable, wouldn't you think?
You could imagine, like, if stable necessarily mean no change, but a tiny gradual change, that isn't noticeable in a couple generations. You know what I mean? Like.
So a kind of very slow case 3, like generational change?
Or
don't have an example.
Or if you take maybe a phonetic, a vowel example, you have slow movement within a range that is tolerated by the community.
Right. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Like maybe like vowel internal variation. Some part of the community is favoring one side of the vowel space, or the other side is favoring the other side. But the social meaning of one side versus the other is exactly the same.
Right.
But I don't know if that's. I mean, this is a theoretical case. I don't know if that's actually happening. Or
no, and I think probably what LeBeau says in describing this table, if not elsewhere, is that of course sociolinguists anyway don't usually study stability. So we are reduced to thinking about the logical possibilities, but there's a lot of internal pressure within the field to study the things that are changing, right? It's the study of language change, not the study of language stability. And yet, what he also says is that, of course, stability might be much more interesting than change. Like, why, in the case that you just described, don't people care that one half of the community is using one half of the distribution and others are using the other half of the distribution? Like, why doesn't that rise to the level of social meaningfulness? Given, I guess it's like the actuation question, isn't it? Like why does change arise in some situations but not in others?
Yeah, right, yeah.
But even if you have something that's unstable, I mean, you can have something that is changing in tiny increments over, I don't know, a really long time, and you can have something that's just volatile and changing like within a generation or, I don't know, a year. Like, I mean, I have no actual examples of that, but certainly there are changes that are happening at different paces.
It seems like be-like could be an example similar to that, if only because in the very early stages, say, like with the last paper we discussed, there was very little change. It was all said, and then all of a sudden, be-like just like took a crazy leap. So I feel like that could be somewhat similar to what you're describing, Sarah.
Yeah, I guess I found this chart a little unsatisfying to satisfying. Because you only have stable versus unstable, and there's no accounting for degrees in between.
So you're saying there might be these cases that feel like stability within a given lifespan, right?
Yeah.
That don't feel like change. Or they may not even feel like change within 3 generations, right? Within living memory.
Yeah, and then we might be just as happy to call them stable, just to a certain degree of stable.
Yeah, so then I think the question is, in that case, why don't you get individual manipulation of that variable, maybe across the lifespan? So the kind of case that you're describing is very similar, I think, to the one that Sankoff and I have been looking at for a while now, which is the case of the Montreal French future temporal reference, where the morphological feature is extremely marginal now in the spoken language, or was in 1984, which is where our data source finished. So it's a little, we know that historically that's a new situation, that it used to be in much wider distribution, it used to be much more frequent, and in fact it used to be the only way to form future temporal reference. But in the present day, arguably, it's almost stable, right? It's very similar to what you described. Probably over the last few generations, if not the last 100 years, there hasn't been a lot of movement in overall frequency of the morphological feature. However, what we do know about that case is that people in a sense are treating it as a stable variable by showing instability over their individual lifespans. So in that case, it would be like number 2. It's really age grading. So I guess we're trying to think of cases where you get stability without individual instability, right? Where either whether it's a very, very slow change or it's true stability, you don't get any social meaning becoming attached to those variants. Why is it that when you have some kinds of variation, they become available for social exploitation? And why, under other circumstances, whatever those may be, don't you get that social exploitation? And I guess we're saying the reason we can't think of that latter scenario is because we don't study it.
Yeah.
Right? We just look at the things that do acquire social meaning,
Yeah.
whether they're stable or not. So that's a lacuna, I think, in our knowledge.
Yeah. One part of well, what's being left out of this discussion is perception.
Right.
Right. So this table and this idea of age grading is based primarily on what people produce, what comes out of their mouths, is not necessarily the way they perceive or what ranges of variation they'll allow for a particular category. Right. So those things ultimately change over the course of or within a community. You have people of different ages perceiving a part of a vowel continuum differently as containing the vowel that's different from the way the younger people perceive that same continuum.
Yes.
So I'm interested. So that'd be another interesting. And I think there are people that are looking at this now, thinking of Tyler Kendall and who did he work with? Valerie Fridland, I believe. They did. They looked at some perceptual experiments looking at the vowel quality, and some of the research that I've done on for my PhD thesis looked at that too, and found age-related differences within perceptual ability. Right. So it'd be interesting to upgrade this table or to make a new table based on solely on perception or the interplay between perception and production. So and I think on some level it might also give us an understanding of, well, there's always that what came first, perception, a change in perception or a change in production when we're talking about phonetic and phonological changes.
Absolutely. No, that's a really good point.
Yeah, that may answer some questions or even complicate age grading even further.
Yes. You know, when we had our own reading group last summer, I remember this came up over and over and over again, where we said, you know, even from the earliest days, from the New York City study, Labov was good at always attempting to collect both community evaluation of variation and also production.
Yeah.
But that's not something that we are very diligent about all the time.
Yeah.
And this is true, particularly these longitudinal studies, which you're right, have privileged production over almost everything else.
But I mean, yeah, yeah, I didn't mean you specifically, but
No.
but that's the way the study, the field is working. But I can see more and more people getting into perception as well.
I think there's also some work by in acquisition, actually, by Laura Wagner on perception of age in talker voices.
Yeah.
And recently, Jim Stanford, I think, had a paper in LBC about language change in New England, where he talks about perception of age vectors. So to what degree are people aware of the age distribution of a sociolinguistic variable in their community? So how do they perceive the direction of change, and how does that factor into community change over time?
Mm-hmm.
No, I'm with you. This is all really important.
Yeah, and you brought up the beginnings of sociolinguistic variationist studies, where they did use these commutation tests and the minimal pair tests, where they got speakers to pronounce things in the minimal pair context and said, okay, now, and play it back to them and say, okay, which word did you hear?
Right.
These are, you're right, they're gone. They're not being used to the same degree. They didn't catch on the same way production, the focus on production caught on. And that's too bad, because we're missing that important set of data that tells us about what's acceptable to a particular listener.
And I think it's not that we're not doing perception work, it's just that the perception work seems to be independent of the production.
Yeah.
What we really need is always to get that same data from the same people.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Okay, skipped ahead. So we got generational change, I think. Is that where we got through?
Yeah. Well, actually, I guess I'll just say about age grading. I think you guys are right to worry about where and when that overlaps with stability or when it isn't stability. And I think I say in this paper, the trouble with community stability is that we just don't have a whole lot of evidence for it. So a lot of this table is logical possibility rather than verified fact. Yeah, so anyway, that's all I have to say about that.
Okay.
Generational change, I guess, is like the thing we're nearly always looking at in variation and change studies.
Yeah.
And I guess one thing that's quite important to say that maybe doesn't get said often enough, and that I may not have said in this paper, is that Labov wrote here that the individual is stable in cases of generational change. Right? So the community as a whole is undergoing some kind of language change, and when we're interpreting our apparent time information, we assume that the oldest members of the community represent the way they sounded when they were teenagers. And I think there's a tendency or a temptation to say that this was an assumption, right? That it was a belief in early variationist work, but that's never been the case. In fact, in his dissertation, Labov acknowledges that this is an assumption of pure convenience, right?
Yeah.
That absolutely it's likely that people change the way they speak as they age. So it's never been the case that all sociolinguists used to think that adults stabilized, and now we're showing that they don't.
Right.
Right? They always acknowledge that possibility.
Yeah,
but it's convenient to assume that if it did happen, it didn't happen at such a rate that it would really interfere with the overall picture.
Right.
So we're just fine-tuning the picture, really, at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. So the generational change is driven by it would have to be at the level of language acquisition then, or at the stage of language acquisition. So where a change is introduced by a newcomer to the community who happens to be, well, then the newcomer has to be a native-born child of the community.
Yes, I think what we assume is that incrementation, right, the increase in every generation of the change, because of child children deducing the wrong facts about the underlying grammar of their community, or, as I think Eckert is really beginning to show in her middle school work, that it's also a social process undergone by older children who are associating more with peers and less with parents, and who are pushing the envelope of an ongoing change in their community. So I don't know, are any of you guys familiar with this work that Eckert has conducted in middle schools in California? No? So I can boil this down to just a few sentences. So she does a wonderful ethnographic project in a number of California middle schools. But the underlying takeaway is that it's young girls in this age range who are the sort of drama queens of the pack, the ones who are racing into adolescence faster than their peers, who are already engaging in boyfriends, even though these boyfriends, it doesn't really go any further than hand-holding, and sometimes the boys in question don't even know that they've been paired up with these girls. They are the ones who are producing the most advanced variants of the local sound change. So she was looking at some sound changes going on in California, like oo fronting and o fronting. So what she's arguing is that some of this incrementation, whereby children exceed their parents' use of an innovation, may come about in part because of one of the oldest speculations in sociolinguistics, which is that women are just more expressive and emotional than men. Right? That's kind of what it boils down to. That girls who have social reasons for being dramatic use ongoing language change as a resource for expressing that drama. And so when you've got multiple ways of producing this vowel that are out there in the community, what you do is latch onto what you perceive to be the most advanced variants, right? So this comes back to Paul's point about perception. These girls at some level are aware which variants are at the extreme end of the distribution, and then they push it a little bit further than that to be as dramatic as they possibly can. So that may also be what's driving generational change. Some of it may come from young children, but a good deal of it probably comes from these 10 to 13-year-olds, 9 to 13-year-olds, who are creating their own non-child identities, I guess. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does, yeah.
Yeah.
They would consider the girls that are in the popular crowd then?
Yeah, she talks about it. Yeah, she talks about the crowd as being this mass that forms at this age, leaving behind the girls who are still children, right? The ones who are still running around, and the crowd starts to encompass the girls who use recess time to walk around the schoolyard and talk to one another and observe the boys who are running around playing games.
Right.
The boys are really very much behind the girls on the developmental curve.
Yeah.
So she talks about the heterosexual market, this idea that in this period of your life, if you're a girl, the way you win power and influence is through alliances with boys, even if, as I said, the boys in question don't necessarily know that their names are being bandied around in this way.
Right.
And I mean, it resonates with me. I absolutely remember this.
Yeah, I was going to say, boys never know. Boys never get it.
Right.
Not maybe at that age.
It's like a variable a penny could look at is whether you stand against the gym wall at the beginning of a dance or whether you're out dancing.
That would probably create the same jock burnout divide, right?
Yeah.
But among middle schools.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I think that's the general take on generational change. And then communal change, I find this one really sort of perplexing. And I'm not really sure what we do with it.
Right. Yeah.
So again, the logical possibility is that individuals are unstable over their lifespans, and that simultaneously the entire community is unstable, undergoing change. And in some discussion of this, Labov Labov describes very different sorts of cases that could fall into this category.
Yeah.
And then more recently, I think other sociolinguists have defined it as being a very sudden kind of change, right, that might happen within a single generation, where everyone changes at once in the same direction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think Miriam Meyerhoff has suggested it would be cases like adoption of taboo.
Right.
And when I teach my students about this table, we tend to skip over 4 and just say that we don't really know what to do with it.
Right. No,
This might be the vanishingly rare cases, but who knows? Or maybe adoption, like community-wide adoption of some new lexical item, maybe for a technological innovation.
Okay.
You could imagine that being a communal change. So we all adopted Google around the same time as a noun and a verb.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, and then number 5.
That would suggest some kind of stability if everyone's doing the same thing, I suppose, right? Would it instead be a case where Google and, say, Yahoo were the lexical items for web searching, and so like there's competition between the two, both within the individual and at the community level?
You could never Yahoo.
It's true.
Sorry, it'd be Bing.
You cannot Yahoo something, it's true.
That's how out of it I am.
Well, I guess the thing is, this is where you need longitudinal information, because if you took a snapshot, it would look like stability. It would look like case 1, right? Everyone would have this lexical item. The only way you know that something had changed is if you could compare now to a generation ago, and then you would see that no one had Google in their vocabulary at all. Right. But there are no, this is a very vague table. I think it's deliberately vague. It doesn't say, for instance, communal change counts only if it happens, within 5 years, or within 10 years, or within a generation.
Yeah. You don't want to put that restriction on it anyway.
No.
Okay, so then the lifespans change. Instability at both levels.
Right. So this is the case. I'm going to bring back Paul's MA thesis because I was such a fan of it, as you can tell. Right. This is exactly what you looked at, right? You were looking at an ongoing change in the community, the Canadian shift.
Yep.
And you were looking at individuals who also change over their high school to college transition with respect.
Right. Yeah, so that was the paper in 4 years after.
Right. So this is a case where, right, the assumption behind Sankoff's lifespan change is that the community is going in one direction and individuals go in that direction post-adolescence as well, right?
Right.
That they manifest ever more frequent or quantitatively stronger versions of the ongoing change as they grow older. So maybe you adopt be like when you're a 20-year-old, like I probably did, and then it creeps into your system, and by the time you're in your mid-30s, like I am now, it's becoming your default. Quotative, right?
Right.
So that would be an example of lifespan change, where the whole community is adopting this thing, but I didn't get it until after I was an adolescent, I think.
Yeah.
But I continue to use it, and I'm using it probably more and more and more as I grow older.
Yeah, I can definitely attest that I use it all the time. I don't think I have any other quotative verbs. And I didn't use it. I didn't use it much as a teenager, I don't think.
Well, I grew up in Britain, and I do, quite oddly enough, remember acquiring go, or noticing go, and go, as you guys will know from the quotative literature, has been the dominant quotative in Britain for young people, and sort of slowed the encroachment of be like, I think, in Britain. Although now be like is wiping out go as well.
Right.
So, so I guess I've had 2 cycles of lifespan change in my quotative system, right? I'd go and now.
Yeah. So the part of this the lifespan change requires some level of contact. I think with the girls or the teenagers I looked at who moved away to larger cities after graduating from high school, that was to some extent accelerated. The changes that they underwent was accelerated by having another norm to focus on or another norm to adhere to.
Right. I mean, I guess another question, one I don't know if you ever answered, is what happened to the people in that study who didn't move to Toronto or someplace bigger? Did they continue to change as well?
They just disappeared. they some of them moved to different towns, different areas. I have a rough idea where they are just through friends of friends, and they some of them were never expected. They never had plans to leave town, but they at some point they did. And so what I was and actually reading this paper kind of brought back this idea of like maybe I should find out where they are,
right,
and study them again. And it's certainly easy for me to pick up on the 4 young women who moved to away to go to university because I still have contact with one of them, and so I can easily find them. But it'd be great because that would be now almost 10 or 12 years after the original study. So I have data from 2001, 2004, and now 10 years. Oh, so it'd be like 13 years. So 10 years since I last spoke with them, right?
No, you should, because then we can compare those people with the women in my Philadelphia study.
Yeah.
Your MA thesis said, what happens if you move from a small town to the epicenter of a sound change?
Yeah.
Right? And my study said, what happens if you live in the epicenter of a sound change and you stay there?
Yeah, right. Oh, yeah, perfect.
That's
a good point of comparison, yeah.
Well, yeah, because I think that the other way we're going to learn about lifespan change is through comparison. Because it's so complicated to do these studies, because it's so difficult to recruit enough people that you, at every iteration of the study, you still have lots of people to talk to.
Right.
I think that comparative panel studies is probably the best way to go at the moment, right? So
yes.
Yeah, now you need to go and find those people.
Consider it done. Actually,
but coming back to your point, I think contact is important. So I think
this is the idea for the project right here. I already have notes.
You're all witnesses, okay? I've just defined Paul's research agenda for the next 2 years. What I was going to say is I think your point about contact is a good one. So I think whether it's contact with people in a different city who are ahead of you with respect to the change, whether it's contact within your own community with younger people who are ahead of you.
Right.
Doesn't really matter. But that's the other thing that needs to be taken into account in these sorts of studies. What's the social network of the person that you're looking at? What's the degree of exposure to the change? So, Paul, you probably know that work by John Singler on Be Like, where people are asked to evaluate the appropriateness of Be Like depending on the job of the person who utters it.
Right. Okay, yeah.
And respondents say things like, well, comedians and DJs, PR people are, it's fine for them to use Be Like, but it's not okay if they're a teacher or a lawyer. Anyhow, so sort of going from there, it makes some sense in the public imagination for people who have contact with younger people who are expected to have younger personas to be using these newer changes, and that's probably going to be true, I think, for individuals. Right. You spend a lot of time with younger people, but maybe not in that teacher-student role where you have a more peer relationship with young people. It makes sense that you're then at least exposed to an innovation or a more advanced version of the change, and you may be in a position to adopt it without sounding like an idiot. Then maybe it's going to happen.
Right, and I think like age grading generally it's an issue of contact in some sense, right?
Right.
You're moving through life stages with different expectations set out or expected of you, different, say, sub-community norm, or what's the community practice norm, that may be different from, where you started 5 years ago. Or I think in this paper you quote Penny on the change from a managerial position to a CEO or something, or a change in your employment status, and that's essentially an issue or a shift in from one set of norms to another. So there's an issue of contact there.
Yeah, I think you can also think of it in terms of audience design competing with speaker design, right?
Yeah.
So if I'm in a job where I have contact with a lot of younger people, let's say, then audience design might dictate that I accommodate in their direction. Mm-hmm. We know that speaker design exists as well, and so with promotion to a higher position in a firm, I've now got to actively present myself as more senior, and that competes with audience design, right?
Right, right, yeah.
And that may go on for lots of people across the lifespan all the time.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it made me think about how someone linguistically might be affected by going from a sort of permanent state of unemployedness and then going through one of these programs that help people get into the workforce and actually acquiring full-time employment.
Right.
Especially if they spend a good chunk of their adult life where they become the most stable unemployed.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's interesting. So you have to rapidly acquire the linguistic norms of your new workplace.
Oh, yeah, right.
That's interesting. That's sort of like a much watered-down version of the Genie case, right, where you sort of get very reduced exposure to some kind of linguistic input.
Right, yeah. It's, right, and I guess it follows in the same tradition of studies that look at upward mobility, or speakers who move from one class status or one class group to another, where they I guess and I don't have any details about any particular studies, but there could be two options at hand. You're already aware of what features you would have to appropriate, and you've already begun to use those, similar to what probably you looked at in your study of rural teenagers who have aspirations to either stay or leave their hometown, right? So yeah, Sarah's paper looked at kids that were going to stay behind, or kids that were going to leave before they actually could put these into motion, right? So it was kids who talked about, oh, well, I'm going to leave as soon as I graduate from high school, and what she found were that their aspirations correlated with their usage of two sociolinguistic variables that are differentially evaluated here in Newfoundland.
Oh, really? I would like to read that. Would you share?
Yeah, for sure.
If that's okay. Yeah, and so that sounds about right to me. I think the In-Ing study that I did shows that when these young women were in high school, but knew where they were going next, right, knew which college they were going to, that was a very good predictor of. In fact, it was a better predictor than social class of their In-Ing use, insofar as social class was determined by their parents' status.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, go on.
Like you see that kind of distinction in some other papers and even in Eckert's work. But in a lot of other places, if you want, like even as a teenager, if you don't really want to be associated with your rural community, the not rural community is right next door. Like you just go there on the weekends, or all of your friends are from there, or something like that, which is different in a more isolated community like home, where if we consider St. John's as urban, it's still 4.5 hours away, and it's still not that easy to get regularly.
Right. So you're not, there's no social practices where the people that Sarah looked at, where they were engaged in urban life or urban practices. They have no connection with the city at all.
So no model for these linguistic norms, you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like aspiration in a vacuum.
Yeah, aspiration would be the only thing that would distinguish you.
At least that's what we were. I was endeavoring to get.
Yeah.
That's really cool. That's really cool. So when we were talking about the tension between exposure and also identity, you managed to get exposure out of the equation and just look at identity, effectively.
Well, I was trying to. I didn't quite go to identity, right? Because I said that aspirations were part of identity, but not necessarily all of your identity.
No, sure. I didn't mean all of your identity. Sorry.
Yeah, no. I tried to distinguish between or tease apart even like identity and aspiration there, where I was just focusing on a couple aspirations. I mean, whenever we talk about aspirations, we end up talking about identity, but I tried purposefully not to do that in the paper.
Okay, well, whatever you want to call it, and I think my point was really that it sounds like because you looked at a rural community, you were able to take contact out of the running as a predictor, right? That's what Paul said, I think.
Yeah, that's
really great.
That's what we were. I mean, I feel like I've done it for the most part. I mean, Paul brought up a couple other issues of I never really looked at who their families had contact with, so who their parents were contacting.
Yeah.
So that could be a potential.
Or whether their parents had the economic means, whether their family took trips, or whether their family stayed home every summer, right?
But you did have a tween.
Yeah.
They did one thing and the other one did the other thing, depending on their aspirations. So that's pretty good.
Yeah.
And I sometimes wonder if, parental aspirations play into one's own aspirations, like the degree to which that makes a difference.
Right. So, you mean like what your parents expect of you, or?
Yeah, well, I guess, do you have outward-facing parents or inward-facing parents?
Yeah, pretty well all of the people that wanted to stay in the community are the people that are in there's not that many people there that are going, man, I wish I could be outside of here, because you could be.
It's great that you looked at a rural community too, because there just aren't so many studies of small communities as there are of large urban ones.
Right.
And are you looking at acquisition in that community?
No, for acquisition, I'm mostly looking at like what features are. So in terms of phonology, features. So it's going to be more theoretical and not really particular.
Okay.
It's not even going to be sociolinguistics.
No. Although it might be. We'll talk later.
Okay. So Suzanne, I have to run to pick up Theo from the daycare, but I'm more than willing to let everybody, like you guys, can stick around and chat.
Sure, I have another 10-15 minutes before I have to pack up and go. So if you would like to stay, that's fine with me too.
Yeah, I think it sounds like people on this end have things to get to as well. So unfortunately, it was great that we could go overtime, but we'll have to do this again because we certainly have more to talk about. It looks like.
Yeah, anytime. I'd be very happy to. And now I'm going to hold you to talking to my students at some point, Paul.
Absolutely. Okay.
Okay. Well.